Ari Strandburg-Peshkin. She's a group leader at the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior. But he did have a PhD in animal behavior and computational biology in Princeton University. And he also had postdoc positions in Max Planck Institute of Ornithology and as well as University of Zurich before joining to the Constance. So she's been looking at a diverse range of animal behavior, collective behavior systems, ranging from primate, and also she's working on human collective decision making as well. So we've seen like human social learning, cumulative culture yesterday, and it'd be nice, how the primate or other animal system would be related or connected to the many other systems computationally. So yeah, please welcome Dr. Ari.
So thanks so much, Wataru, and also thanks to all the organizers for inviting me. It's exciting to be here in this hilarious movie theater setting. Yeah, as Wataru was mentioning, I study group coordination in a wide variety of species. So I'm actually going to be telling you a little bit about meerkats today. But to just get us started, I wanted to just mention that group coordination, yeah, okay, good. So coordination is something that is really widespread in nature and occurs across a wide variety of species, but also across have to coordinate their behavior, some of which I'll be talking about today. And underlying all forms of coordination is some form of communication among group members, right? In order for group members to coordinate their behavior, they have to be responding kind of to the passively generated cues that others in their environment are giving. And this can lead to coordinated behaviors such as flocking and even things like leadership by informed members of groups, or even through to stuff like democratic decision-making. And so all these things can emerge without any form of explicit signaling. But when we look across nature, we actually find that signaling, by which I mean kind of actively producing information, such as vocal signals, which I'll be talking about today, is important in many systems. So for example, vocalizations that are given in the context of coordination are given to maintain cohesion while animal groups are on the move. You often find vocal signals associated with initiating group departures. And you also find them in situations of collective action, for example, to recruit others to join when defending your group against predators or fighting against competitors. And so this is the research focus of my group, really, is to understand both how groups coordinate with one another, but also the role that communication, in particular this vocal signaling, plays in mediating these coordination processes. And we study these processes across a wide range of different species. In particular, right now, we're focusing on 3 species of social carnivores that span a range from very tightly cohesive groups that are basically always together and constantly moving around together and having to coordinate where they go, through to what's called fission-fusion groups, where animals form small subgroups that split and merge with each other over time. And so I'm actually today, and this research is done with a fantastic team of collaborators, both in Constance and also internationally, as well as with a couple of long-term field studies, without which none of this work would be possible. So today I wanted to, instead of kind of giving you a broad overview of these 3 species, I wanted to dig more into one species. And so I've chosen the meerkats for you today. And I'm going to be talking about group coordination in 2 different contexts. One is in the context of collective movement decisions, and then secondly, in the context of vocal turn taking. And this, I'm going to start with collective movement decisions. And this project is in collaboration with a bunch of people, especially led by Baptiste Averly, who is a PhD student in the group. So when we think about collective decision-making, this topic is something that has really received a lot of attention and been interesting to us as humans for many, many years. To prove this to you, I have a quote from Aristotle, because it's always good to have a quote from Aristotle in your talk. And he says that some of these animal groups, he's talking about, obey a leader, others are more anarchical. The stork and the bee are the former class, and the ant and many others belong to the latter. Of course, it being Aristotle, he's very sure that he knows what he's talking about, but not quite actually correct, but it's okay. This actually at least highlights a spectrum that we still talk about today when thinking about collective decisions, which is the spectrum from shared decisions, where all individuals basically have equal say in a decision outcome, and unshared decisions where one individual has all the say and everyone is simply following what they do. And interest in this topic has continued to this day through a lot of research, both theoretical and empirical, looking at this topic across different species and different contexts. So one of the main questions that we seek to answer in this area is the question of who has influence over group decisions. And another question that is often addressed that I think is relevant both in animals and in humans is whether influence is correlated with other aspects. For example, in animal groups, there's often a dominant structure to the group, a social dominant structure. For example, certain individuals may dominate the breeding or have priority of access to resources such as food. And so the question is, do those socially dominant individuals also have increased influence over group decisions? So I'm going to be talking about this question in meerkats. And so I thought I would briefly give you a quick primer on meerkats. So meerkats are a social mongoose species that live in groups from anywhere to just a couple up to 40 or 50 individuals. Usually it's kind of in the range of a dozen to 20. These are stable groups that stay together over long periods of time. They have a dominant breeding pair, meaning a dominant male and a dominant female that monopolize the breeding. There are sometimes subordinates breed as well, but it's not as common. And they have a weird, kind of a weird reproductive system known as cooperative breeding, where there's this dominant pair that monopolizes the breeding, and then the subordinate members of the group actually raise their younger siblings. So it ends up that everybody in the group, it ends up that most of the individuals in the group are quite related, with the subordinates helping to rear the younger litters. And important for the questions of coordination, groups travel collectively up to a couple of kilometers each day, which is quite impressive that they're really quite small, like this big. And they stay together throughout the day, maintaining high cohesion with their group mates, very rarely splitting. And they do this while foraging for food. And in order to coordinate that cohesion, they use a lot of acoustic communication. In fact, acoustic communication is a huge part of their lives. They basically never shut up if you're out there with them. And their communication system is incredibly well characterized. They have over 30 different distinct call types that have been characterized, primarily due to the work of my collaborator, Marta Manzer, also primarily due to the Kalahari Meerkat Project, which is a long-term research study that's been going on in the Kalahari Desert, South Africa for over 25 years, led by Marta Manzer and Tim Cluttenbrook, where they can study these meerkats at very close range. So they have several, usually around a dozen at a time, meerkat groups that are highly habituated to human presence. So they can be monitored just following them on foot at close range. And they can be observed in terms of their behavior. And they can also even do pretty amazing things like weigh them multiple times a day on portable scales so that they can get at things like foraging success, which is quite cool. And so also because of the work of Marta Manzer, who's been really studying their communication system over the past 25, 30 years, this really gives us a lot of information on what kind of vocalizations they produce and in what context they're given and kind of what they mean, if you will. So when we think about this collective coordinated movement that I've been telling you about, so if you imagine that you're an individual meerkat, you have to be deciding at any moment in time while you're kind of foraging for food, both where you're going to move next, which you might do with respect to where the others in your group are, as well as the type of vocalizations that they're giving. And you also have to be deciding what you're going to say next, which you might also be doing, again, in relation to both of these pieces of information. And so what we have is that these meerkats have this kind of complex interplay between movement and vocalizations. Unpicking this interplay to try and understand how individuals are making decisions and ultimately how this leads to group decisions and the question of who has influence is a topic that we are currently investigating in my group. And I think tackling this question has been in the past and is still currently very hard. But it's a lot of the challenges due to methodological issues. There's a really nice quote in the book On the Move, which I highly recommend to everyone, about animal movement, which says that it's an observational task of daunting dimensions to attempt to record the actions of many potential decision maker animals at once. So the idea is that if we want to understand how these groups are coordinating, we need to have a detailed understanding of what each individual at the group is doing. And we need to have this for all the individuals in the group. And with the traditional methods of behavioral ecology or field biology, where you're out in the field as a human observer, this is really hard because usually you can either kind of get a broad overview of the group, kind of where everyone is, what's the group spread, or you can really narrow in and focus on one individual. But being able to get both a broad perspective and detailed information on all the individuals and what vocalizations they're giving and where they are is something that it would be impossible for a human to do. So in order to tackle this daunting task, we use some really useful new technologies that are now available, primarily due to the miniaturization of all electronics due to the cell phone industry, which is we created these GPS and audio collars, which are small enough to fit on meerkats. They weigh about 25 grams, which is about the size of a AA battery. And these collars contain a GPS device, which can record GPS positions of individuals at 1 fix per second. And they also contain an audio recorder to record the vocalizations that they're giving. And finally, they have a magnetic clasp in them, which allows us actually, due to the kind of amazing habituation level of this system, to put these collars on without the need to even capture or anesthetize the individuals. So this is something that's really unique to the system, and I think it's really great because we can do this in a very non-invasive way. We just put the collar on, it stays on for about a week, and then we just take it off. So what we can do is use these collars on whole groups of meerkats. We can usually get, if on the more habituated groups, we can usually get most of the individuals in the group. And so just to show you some of the audio data coming off of these collars, I want to play you a couple clips. Let's see if this works. Yeah, it's kind of quiet, but. So if you hear, there's those little kind of pulsed calls. There's one. And a bunch of scratchy noise, and then there's another call. So those calls that you hear are called cohesion calls. I'll come back to them later. Basically, they give these calls very frequently while foraging, and they're thought to be used to maintain cohesion with group mates. They're sort of pinging back and forth to each other. And the scratchy noises that you hear in the back is actually the meerkats digging, because what they do throughout most of the day when they're foraging is they dig for vertebrates and small invertebrate prey in the sand. And then, so that's what most of the recordings sound like. And then occasionally you have some other types of calls. For example, these. So these are known as move calls, and they're associated with the initiation of rapid group departures. So what we can then do is put these things together and get a picture like this. So here, each dot, each marker represents a meerkat, and the kind of small fill shadings, things that are coming up around them are representing the calls that they're giving. So you see a lot of those close calls that I was mentioning, the cohesion calls that allow them to stay together, and also some other types of calls. And so this really is a very rich data set that can potentially give us a lot of information on how these groups are coordinating with each other. However, we face a really daunting challenge that anyone who has worked with audio data will probably be familiar with, which is that we get these raw audio files, and we have to extract the calls from them, and we have to classify them into types. So I know you all have untrained eyes here, but if you can just stare at this for a second and try and see if you can pick out where you think the calls might be in these recordings. I'll give you a few seconds to try that. And okay, there they are. And I colored them based on the type. So you can see there's a lot of noise, and it's actually a pretty challenging task to do this even as a human. And of course, we have hundreds and hundreds of hours of audio recording, so we don't want to do this only with human labelers. So what we're developing now is ways to automatically identify and classify calls using machine learning. I'm not really going to get too much into this, but I just wanted to mention we're taking two approaches. One is a supervised approach where we're basically using human labels and trying to train the machine to label the data like a human would. And the other is what's called an unsupervised approach, where we're taking the acoustic properties of the calls and trying to cluster them in a kind of lower dimensional space to try and explore the vocal repertoire in a way that is not as dependent on human labels. So that's all work in progress, and I have to say that it's not quite there yet. So today we're talking about this, going back to this question about who has influence over group decisions. I'm going to tell you just about the movement data. I'll bring in a tiny bit of audio at the end. Back to this question of who influences group decisions now that we have this data. So before we can answer this question, we have to answer a more basic question, which is, what do we even mean by influence? And I think what we would like to mean when we say this is that an individual's behavior causes the group to do something. But this causal question is really hard to get at, especially without any sort of experiment. So I think what we kind of end up being able to do with the type of data we're able to collect is looking at when individual behavior is followed by group behavior. And what do I mean by that? We can actually measure this in a variety of different ways. So we can come up with like a variety of different proxies for individual influence. And I have a review paper, there's a thing at the bottom about kind of what types of methods are out there. Today, I'm going to talk about three possible ways of doing this. One is really simple, just looking at spatial positioning in the group, asking the question who's in front. A lot of previous studies have kind of looked at who's in front as a proxy for who's leading the group. The second is using the temporal dynamics of the group to look at who does something first. I'll go more into that in a bit. And then the final thing is to look at decision outcomes. Who is actually benefiting from these group decisions? Because maybe this is a kind of indirect way at getting at who is influencing group decisions. So let's start with this simple position one. So these are a bunch of trajectories of meerkats. And what we can simply do here is we can take the centroid of the group, so the mean position of all the individuals. We can construct what I call the group reference frame, which is basically the direction of motion of the group, and kind of project everyone onto these group axes. And then we can look at where individuals tend to position themselves relative to the group direction motion. And you can see here, you see some different individuals in the columns and different weeks in the rows. The color represents how often they're in a given location relative to the group. And you can see that there are some individual differences. In particular, for example, this individual on the left seems to be more towards the front, and the individual on the right seems to be very concentrated at the center. It turns out that this individual on the left is actually the group's dominant female. And to simplify these things, let's just look at the proportion of time individuals are in the front half of the group on each day and make some histograms of that. And what so this is the same data shown that way, where you can see that the dominant female here shown in yellow is actually the one that seems to be more often towards the front of the group relative to both the dominant male, who's this orange, as well as the subordinate individuals in the red and the black. So this is for this one group. And if we actually did this, we have tracking data currently for 5 different groups across 3 different years. And you can see that it's quite, variable, but on the whole, dominant females are more often found in the front of the group. So this already suggests that maybe dominant females are doing something different. However, this is also not true in all groups. For example, this one from 2021. So this also highlights there's quite a bit of variability in this spatial positioning. Okay, so that's spatial positioning. Now let's move on to dynamics. So when we think about changes in group movement, or when we think about rather decision-making about group movement, individuals have to be coming to consensus both on the direction of movement, so where are they going to go, but also on the timing of movement. When are they going to go? How fast are they going to go? Because if you don't come to consensus also on how fast we're traveling, then the group will kind of split along the front-back axis. And these two types of decisions are actually potentially really different. And this has been elaborated in a lot of in some theoretical work. One of the main differences is that they have different kind of abilities to compromise. So for example, for direction, suppose you're meeting a bunch of friends and you're going to go to a restaurant. So there's one restaurant on the east end of town and one restaurant on the west end of town. If you're coming to consensus on the direction of where you're going, it doesn't really make any sense to compromise by going, I guess in this case, north, right? It only makes sense to choose one or the other. Whereas if you're gonna, some part of the group wants to go at 7 and some part wants to go at 6, then you can compromise by going at 6:30. So in some ways, timing decisions are kind of easier to compromise than directional decisions, especially when they're kind of concrete destinations. But what's kind of interesting is that these types of decisions are, when you're in a collectively moving group, are often occurring simultaneously. So we need a way to disentangle, because we think these decisions could potentially be different, but they're also occurring simultaneously in a group on the move. We need a way to disentangle these two types of decision making. So we developed I would say, relatively simple method for looking at this. So imagine that you have this group here of these gray individuals, and we want to know the influence, or again, a proxy for influence, of this purple individual over the group direction. So what we do is we look at the orange here represents the center of the group, taken as the mean position of all the individuals. So we look at this, the group movement over some period of time. The centroid has moved a certain amount, the individual has moved a certain amount. And what we do is we first measure the individual's speed to the right or to the left relative to the group's travel direction. Then we look into the future and we see whether the group turned right or left. So the idea here is basically, if an individual in the past going right relates, increases the probability of the group turning right in the future, that individual could be said to have influence. Again, we can't really totally get at causality here, but this is an example of the group following the individual's behavior. So what we can then do is we can plot the individual left-right speed on the x-axis here, and the probability that the group turns right on the y-axis here. And what we find is these kind of sigmoidy shaped curves, just empirically from the data. But this kind of also makes sense, because if you imagine an individual going more to the right is associated with a greater probability of the group turning right in the future. However, what we also find is that depending on which individual you're looking at, you get a different type of curve. So some individuals have more flat curves like this, where the individual's direction of movement in the past doesn't really seem to have any association with the group's probability of turning in that direction. So we would consider that a relatively low influence individual. Or you could have a more steep curve like this, where an individual moving to the right in the past really increases the probability that the group ultimately turns right. And so what we can do is we can fit these curves for each individual in each group. And then to simplify things, what we do is we just take one point along this curve. We've chosen the 90% quantile, but it doesn't really matter too much. And we can use this value of the probability of turning right at this 90% quantile as what I'm going to call the turn influence. So this is a measure of the influence of an individual over the turn or over the direction of the group. So this is now the turn influence for, again, that group, that first group that I showed you from 2017. And here, one thing quickly jumps out of this plot, which is that the dominant female, again, here shown in yellow, has the highest turn influence. Then we have the dominant male second, and then we have the other individuals coming further down. If we again look at this across all of our groups, we find a general recurring pattern that the dominant female, there's of course a lot of variability, but overall we have, I would say, relatively strong evidence that the dominant females seem to have higher turn influence than the rest of the group. And I think this actually makes a lot of sense because the dominant females tend to be the oldest individuals in the group as well. And they also in particular are the ones who have been in the territory for the longest. So what happens is that when male meerkats reach sexual maturity, they tend to disperse and move to new territories, but females tend to stay with the group for longer and then, eventually can become dominant. So this kind of suggests that, it would make sense to have a dominant, or rather to have an individual also with experience in the territory leading the group, or at least that's one interpretation. Okay, so that's over influence over group direction, but I also mentioned that we want to quantify influence over group speed. So again, we're going to look at the influence of this purple individual relative to the group, and this is going to be relatively simple, or relatively similar to the previous one. So imagine, again, the group, we look at the group's movement, and we look at, in particular, whether an individual is going faster or slower than the group. So the speed relative to the group's current speed, basically, along the group travel direction. And then later in the future, we look at whether the group sped up or slowed down. So the idea is that if I speed up and then the group speeds up, this might indicate that I have influence over the group's, or that I have influenced the group's speed on average. So again, we can make these curves where on the y-axis, we now have the probability of the group speeding up, and on the x-axis, we have the individual front-back speed difference. We can draw these curves for each individual in the group. And again, we can do a similar thing that we did with the turn influence and get the speed influence. And here again, I think the pattern isn't quite as clear. However, it's still on the whole the case that these dominant females seem to be coming out at or near the top of their groups in terms of the speed influence. I promised that I would bring in vocalizations. One thing that we're doing now is also looking at how vocalizations or active signaling might kind of modulate individual influence. So if individuals vocalize, can they momentarily increase their influence? And preliminary, so for example, these calls that I showed you before, the move calls, these have been previously shown to be associated with initiating group departures. So we would expect that they should be associated with kind of individuals having increased influence over the speed of the group. And if we compare instances where where individuals were not giving move calls to instances where they were giving move calls and look at the speed influence, we can see that the curves get a bit steeper. Interestingly, also, if we compare if we look at the turn influence or the influence over group direction, we also find that, if individuals are not giving move calls, the curves look like something like this. But once we look at cases where the individuals are giving move calls, the curves seem to get much steeper. So this suggests that vocalizations really are playing a role in mediating these influence patterns. And this is something that we're trying to get into now. Also, working on the machine learning to extract more of the calls so we can have a bigger sample size. So this is all kind of to be continued on this dynamic stuff. And hopefully, once we're able to have a greater sample size, we'll be able to figure out some more dynamical patterns. So now for the question of, so we talked about spatial positioning, we talked about dynamics. Now I want to talk about who benefits, outcomes. And this is, again, kind of an indirect way of getting at who has influence over group decisions. So one of the decisions that meerkat groups have to make on a daily basis is which burrow they're going to go to, because they actually use a number of burrows throughout their territory where they spend the night, and they don't use the same one each time. So they also have to be, at the end of the day, coming to consensus on where to go. And I think this is a nice decision because it's kind of has a very clear outcome that we can look at. So they have to decide both which burrow, but again, they also have to decide when to return. And so the question is, can we use these burrow decisions to say something about who is benefiting from them? So to do that, we actually made use of over 20 years of data on burrow usage in these meerkat groups. This is a visualization from some of the long-term data where each dot represents a meerkat group. And I want to point out that this data was all recorded manually by human observers going each night to, not every night, but a lot of nights, to meerkat burrows and recording where the group went down. So this is something that's a really cool data set to have access to, and something that's really shows the extremely cool nature of long-term studies. So yeah, 20 years of data, 26 unique groups, and that means we have 65,000 group decisions of whether the groups stay or switch. And I mentioned the question of who benefits. Well, what do I mean by benefiting? Well, one way that meerkats can benefit is by doing well in foraging. So this meerkat has done really well here. It's got a nice, juicy prize. And we can actually measure, as I was mentioning before, the weight of these meerkats by coaxing them onto small scales using a bit of egg, a tiny bit of an egg or a little tiny bit of water. You can measure them multiple times per day to get at their weight gain, basically a proxy for how well they did at foraging. And so when we look, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this, but when we look at the decision of which burrow, we actually find that meerkats are more likely to switch burrows when their dominant female in particular had low foraging success. So basically they were at a certain burrow and then their dominant female didn't do well foraging. This is associated with an increased probability of their switching burrows, which kind of suggests again that dominant females here, and this was not true of the males, or not as associated with the males or the subordinates. So this again is kind of suggesting that these dominant females may have more influence over the group direction, or this directional decision of which burrow. For the timing decision, though, we actually find something slightly different, which is that when we look at when meerkats return to the burrow, we actually find that they're more likely to return late to the burrow when subordinates had low foraging success. So it seems like this timing decision might be a little bit potentially more controlled by the subordinates in the group, or sort of the aggregate group, as opposed to the dominant female in particular. And I think this is, slightly in conflict with the dynamical results I showed you earlier, although I will say that the effect sizes for both of these are kind of relatively small. So I want to be a little bit cautious in how we interpret these. And I also think that we found in our dynamical work as well that the speed influence had the kind of like overall less strong patterns than the turn influence. So just to sum this up, I talked about a number of different ways that we can conceptualize and measure influence. I also want to point out that this is only like a few of the ways. There's actually a ton of other ways that you can do it, especially from collective behavior data. We talked about position, dynamics, and outcomes. And for the position, we found that dominant females were more often in the front. For the dynamics, we found also evidence that dominant females have higher turn influence, and also that they may have higher speed influence. And then when we look at the outcomes, we found that dominant females' foraging success seems to predict burrow choice, but not necessarily the timing of return. So I would say, like, taking all of these three lines of evidence, or I guess four, I don't know how you count them, lines of evidence together, I think we do have relatively good evidence that dominance is associated with influence in these meerkat groups. But again, there's a lot of variability there, and I think that we need to look more at the role of vocalizations and mediating influence, which is something that we are going to do. And also I want to once we have a larger sample size of groups, which we're working on now, we can start looking at the role of group composition, because we did find that in some groups, the dominant females were not as influential. And that begs the question as to why. We have some hypotheses about that, some kind of inklings, but we don't have a big enough sample size for that. So we are working on increasing our sample size there. Okay, let's see how we're doing on time. So I have until 10. Okay, yeah, I'll go more quickly through this one. So next, I want to talk about vocal turn taking, and this is work that was in collaboration with Vlad Demartsev and Marta Manzer. So far, when talking about group coordination, I've been mainly talking about situations that are kind of like this: a bunch of individuals that are doing the same thing at the same time, staying together, coordinating with each other. But I also want to highlight that coordination is a versatile concept, and not all coordination looks like this. Some of it may look like this, where in this scenario, you definitely would not want everybody doing the same thing at the same time. Rather, it's much better if they all take turns. And when we think about communication, and if you think about, for example, human conversation, It actually is kind of a coordination problem. So you've all probably been in conversations that were kind of like this, where everybody's just talking at the same time and nobody's really listening. And they're not extremely effective at communicating information, I would say. Maybe some political conversations are like this. So turn taking can be a way to allow for effective communication between participants in a conversation. And when we look at humans groups, we find that turn taking is actually a universal across human languages, including things like sign language, so also outside the acoustic realm. And it's also something that appears very early in infancy. There's also been some work on turn taking in animals. It's been observed in a couple of different, several species, but it's also been mainly studied in pairs in the context of duetting displays. And so one question that we have is, can turn taking also persist when you have larger groups that are trying to communicate with each other? So to get this, we went to this very simple stationary context, lots less going on here than in the stuff I was showing you earlier. This is in the morning, meerkats wake up, they come out of their burrows and they stand there in the sun warming up. And while they're doing this, they give these little calls, which maybe you'll be able to hear. They're very quiet. Yeah, okay. So there's just these very kind of soft, relatively chill calls. These are called sunning calls for obvious reasons. And what we do know about these calls is that they only call when other individuals are around. An individual out there sunning by itself is not going to call. And also the function of these calls is unknown. We don't really know why they seem to be kind of chit-chatting back and forth to each other, but we don't really know why they're doing that. And just to avoid disappointment later, you still won't know the function of these calls at the end of this talk. However, I have some ideas about it. But what we did look at is, in this case, are these vocal exchanges coordinated in any way? So in terms of temporally coordinated. So to do that, we actually used kind of simpler methods than before, just recording individual meerkats with a boom mic. And this is Vlad, who is very large compared to the meerkats. And we looked at how often the meerkats interrupted each other, and we wanted to see, like, do they sort of avoid interrupting each other? And the way that we can do that is we can look at these recordings, and Vlad or whoever was recording noted down whether when he heard a call, he noted down whether it was the focal individual, so the one he had pointed the microphone at calling, or whether it was one of the other individuals in the background. So we have these kind of two tracks where we have the focal calls represented by these red boxes and the background calls. And then what we just did was we computed the overlap rate, the amount of overlap between these two sequences. So that's a measure of how often they are interrupting each other. But we want to know whether they are interrupting each other kind of more often than we would expect. And to get at this, we actually used two different methods. I'm just going to show you one, which is that we did a time shift of one of these tracks relative to each other, or to the other, and then we computed a shifted overlap rate. So what I'm going to show you now is the overlap rate here on the y-axis as a function of this time shift. And 0 here with this dashed line represents the natural data, and anything forward or back from 0 represents shifting the tracks relative to each other. And so what we would expect to find if they are avoiding overlap is a kind of V-shaped curve where you have a minimum at 0 and then it kind of increases on both sides. And in fact, this is exactly what we find when we look at the data. They seem to be avoiding overlap also at a relatively fine temporal scale. So we wanted to know a little bit more about this, in particular, kind of if you're an individual, how are you producing this pattern? So to get at this, we looked at the rate of focal calling both immediately after a context-specific call, and we looked at this over increasing time windows, which I'm going to show you in the next plot. And we compared this to random times in the data set, the focal call rate over different time windows. So what I'm showing you now is on the y-axis, the call rate, which is just the percentage of time that an individual was calling, as we increase the time window. So what we found is that actually over short time spans after you hear an individual in your group call, the call rate after a conspecific call is suppressed, here the red, relative to random times, here the black. So basically this explains like the kind of overlap avoidance that we're seeing. They're suppressing their calls after they hear someone call over a short period. But if you look over a long term, these curves actually flip. And then over longer time periods, individuals actually enhance their call rates relative to random times. So we have this kind of short-term suppression and long-term enhancement pattern. And this, I think, is leading to a kind of call and response dynamic where individuals are holding back when another is calling, but that then increases the probability of them calling back. And that allows them to kind of continue this, this back and forth exchange. Just to make sure that this wasn't some kind of artifact, we also did a playback experiment where we played back these sending calls. And in fact, as well as playing back nothing. And we found the exact same pattern. So we really think this is like a causal effect here. So just to sum this part up, sending call exchanges do show coordination and do show the avoidance of overlap. And this seems to be mediated through short-term suppression and long-term enhancement of calling. And so this is an example of self-organized turn-taking that is occurring beyond pairs, but actually in larger groups of individuals. So of course, we want to expand this work to also look at cases where the group is moving to ask whether in this moving context, individuals are also taking turns. This is where these cohesion calls come in. I showed you these before. These are the ones that they're giving, kind of pinging back and forth while on the move to maintain cohesion. And so we can also, we've started a preliminary analysis where we're also looking at these calls to see whether they're also kind of similarly doing turn taking. And we started this just looking at the dyad level. So these curves here represent calls of each individual. Similar to before, we can kind of line them up with each other and look at an individual's call rate relative to relative to the time that another individual called. We can do this across all individuals in the group and kind of average this. This is actually, if anybody does neuroscience, is kind of similar to kind of looking at the neural response of a neuron triggered on a particular moment in time, particular stimulus. And what we would expect to find is that if there's no interaction, we should get kind of a flat curve, right? It doesn't matter where I set my zero. There's no kind of increase or decrease relative to the timing of another individual's call. If we get a peak like this, it would suggest that individuals are calling at the same time, which might be due to an external context. If we get a dip like that, this would, similar to before, suggest that they're avoiding overlap. And if we get something that looks kind of like this, where we have multiple peaks occurring before and after zero, this would suggest that they're doing a call and response. So we looked at this. This is really preliminary data, but we actually looked at this for pairs that are different distances from each other because we thought the role of space might be important here. And if you look at individuals that are very close to each other and you construct this kind of average curve, what we find is that we actually find these kind of peaks that we think are associated with a call and response pattern. So they're having this kind of call and response in these cohesion calls at short range, but we don't find really a dip, which would be suggesting overlap avoidance. So it doesn't seem like they're avoiding overlap in this context, but they are doing this call and response. And as we go out to larger distances, these peaks persist for a while, and then eventually they kind of fall into the noise. So we think that this call and response is really occurring more at short distances, and also there's this overall decay with distance, which I'm not really going to get into. But we think what may be going on here, which is actually going back to a hypothesis from a 2017 paper, is that individuals are having these call exchanges. So meerkats are basically responding to each other's calls over short distances. They're doing this call and response dynamic, and this is leading to the buildup of these local hotspots of calling. Meerkats are then actually attracted to these vocal hotspots. We have some evidence of this from previous work, and this is then a mechanism for keeping the group together. Okay, so just to briefly sum up, for this coordination of calling, we find that overlap avoidance is occurring during sunning, but not foraging, and that we have this call and response and social stimulation of calling in both contexts. And we also have this spatial dependence and potential involvement in the cohesion mechanism during foraging. So I think the overall takeaway here is that we've shown that communication is something that underlies coordination of movement, but I think it's also important to think about communication itself as a coordination challenge and something that also needs to be understood of how the actual exchange of information via communication is coordinated. So moving forward, I'm really interested in looking at, are there common principles of communication and coordination across different species and also across different contexts of coordination, only some of which I talked about today. And overall, I'm interested in asking, what can we actually learn from the commonalities across systems? What does it mean if systems are solving similar problems in similar ways? But also, what can we learn from the differences in how different systems are solving these similar challenges? What does that tell us about the evolution of communication and coordination systems? And for all of these, I want to highlight again that this is a huge collaborative effort, especially when we're bringing in multiple species. So with that, I want to thank all of my collaborators. I think we hopefully still have a little bit of time for questions, and thank you all for your attention.